I think most of you probably know Christof's name. Christof Koch research in computational neuroscience have been broad and influential, from work on individual neurons and dendritic trees to up to consciousness. At the lowest level, he has been working on biophysics of computation. Information processing in single neurons is in fact the title of one of his books. And he has been very productive, lot of publications, unique contributions, such that News and Views, in Nature and Science, his radio and TV interviews, the appearance in the National Geographic, the LA Week and Playboy magazine. As you probably know, I believe that we need to understand the brain at many different levels, from the level of the hardware and the neurons and the synapses up to the computational level. And Christof is one of the few speakers who could speak about any of these levels and all of them. And probably would have spoken today about the work he's doing at the Allen Institute. Christof was for a long time a professor at Caltech, and then is now the president of the Allen Institute, which is funded by Paul Allen, probably in the order of $500 million or so, and it's several hundred people working on understanding, among other things, the brain of a mouse. And but instead, I challenged him by inventing a title for his talk, something I believe, and he does not quite believe, whether the Turing test for intelligence is the same as a Turing test for consciousness. So he will tell you why I'm wrong, and you can learn more for sure in his popular book about the quest for consciousness, reporting work done with the late Francis Crick on the problem of consciousness and the neural substrate for it. You know, on a personal note, I'm more than proud to introduce Christof. He was my first graduate student back in Germany at the Max Planck Institute. He's now one of my most trusted friends. He worked with me in many different papers and projects, and it was a lot of fun to work together. I'm quoting Paul Samuelson. Is one of the real intellectual giants I had the fortune to meet. He wrote, "One of the great pleasures in academic life is to see a younger savant develop, evolving to a co-author and colleague, and then, best of all, to have the right sight of a friend in science who forges well ahead of you." Christof Koch.
Thank you, Tommy. So Tommy gave me this question, which I'm not answering here. It's just a question. It's your lucky day. It's Friday the 13th, and you'll actually get an answer to this question. How many people here, without reflecting more about it, how many people here believe that the answer to this question is yes? And how many believe the answer is no? All right. Okay, so it's the first time I'm giving this talk because I took a serious Tommy's challenge to design a talk around his title. So is there a way we can turn down the lights a little bit? So what do you see here? Just tell me, what do you see? What's going on here? Yes, it's Halloween, but there's more here. Come on, we're all intelligence. What's the story here? This was taken last Halloween, November 2017. Crippled, yes. Yes, they're all in trouble, they're wounded, and all right. So this is, you can all glance quickly or less quickly just by looking at this picture. You can sort of reason about it. You can also tell me something about the age of the people and what are they doing and and what's the relationship to each other, and where are they, and things like that. A whole set of questions you can ask using your natural intelligence. Now, what do you see here? All right. Now, in both cases, you have a conscious visual experience. Here, a very simple visual experience, but it shares with the previous image exactly the same subjective, experiential, phenomenological qualia. These are just different names, all for the same thing, ineffable, irreducible thing we call consciousness or experience or feelings. They're very different words. They all denote the same. They all denote the same thing. Experimentally, so how do you measure consciousness? For example, if you're doing, in a scanner or you're dealing with animals. So typically, for example, here you can take, it's a cartoon, of course, you take an image like this, and people see it, this person's looking at it, and you can look at the brain, the brain signatures, sort of you can track the footsteps of consciousness throughout the brain of people, and you can isolate by, for example, comparing what happens if the person doesn't see it because he's still looking at the image, but now he's being, for example, the image, the stimulus is being masked or is being distracted. So although it's physically present on the retina, the subject doesn't perceive it. And this is one of the more popular techniques. You can track what Francis Crick and I call, what's today called the neural correlates of consciousness. The sort of the minimal neuronal mechanisms that are jointly sufficient to generate any one conscious experience. And you can do it in different forms. So you can also do it imagery, right? You ask the person, close your eyes, and then, I just showed you this image of these yellow butterflies, etc. Try to remember it. You can do sort of, well, here I am sitting. This is sort of higher order thought. Here I am looking at an image that's yellow. You can think about thinking. Right? And you can think about thinking, maybe second, maybe some people can do it third order. You can think about other abstract concepts that don't have a sensory component like beauty or truth or 42 or E equals mc square. And then you can also do this. You can have what many traditions both in the West and in the East, particularly Buddhist, call a pure experience or a no-content experience, when you are clearly not asleep, by, for example, EEG criteria, you're not dead, obviously. You're conscious, but there is no content to your consciousness. I had this recent experience. It was quite transformational for me. I was in Singapore, and I was going to a immersion tank. How many people have been in an immersion tank? Okay, they're really cool, right? So what it is, you strip completely naked, you lie inside this warm water that's body temperature, 600 pounds of Epsom salt are dumped into the water, so you float, you shut the lid, you're complete in the dark, there's no sound. So you very quickly lose your body, the sensation of your body, you become bodiless. Since there is no light, you become sightless. Since there is no sound, except early on, you can actually hear your heartbeat. It's the only time I ever heard my heartbeat. But that quickly you adapt to it, it also goes away. Your sense of passage of time goes away. And then if early on, you're sort of somewhat anxious about it and what's going to happen, and I'm going to get scared, or am I going to get bored? And then if you try to not think any thoughts, you also become mindless. So after some timeless interval, you go into this state where you're bodiless, soundless, sightless, mindless, timeless. And it's a fantastic state. It's an exceptional state. People have written rapturous things about it. I don't want to do that. I'm sort of trying to be, to the extent that I can, an objective scientist. We're trying to think how to do experiments on this. But it's a very special state, and you exit out of it. So 2 hours later, my daughter frantically knocked on the lid because she said, Dad, are you all right? Because I just literally lost track of it. So this is a remarkable state where you have no experience. A lot of people call this a mystical moment. Now, there's another state that if you, like I do, you hang out with neurologists, or you occasionally go to the emergency room in clinics and encounter patients, and I'll show you some data later on, who are grievously injured. For example, a patient, some of you older may remember, Terry Schiavo. She was in what's called a persistent vegetative state where her eyes open, her eyes close. People occasionally, they have movement left, right? They have what neurologists think of brainstem reflexes left. But there's no lawful relationship between what the person by the bedside, trying to communicate with this patient says and any response of the patient. So as far as we can tell, the patients are completely unresponsive. But we know for various techniques that probably 20% of these people actually have experiences. They're actually conscious inside their body. There is actually some mind inside their grievously injured body. And so in both cases, in the case of the clinic and the case of this here, you have, from a computational point of view, from a point of view of intelligence, there's no computation going on, there's no information processing going on, there's no mapping going on, there's no function going on, yet here you are, you have an experience. So what is the consciousness? What is consciousness? So this is a famous definition by Thomas Nagel in his essay, What is it like to be a bat? If there's something that it's like to be an organism, that's just one out of many definitions. Ultimately, the only way to access it, this is the one thing that makes consciousness more difficult to study than black holes or intelligence or viruses or brains, is that it has this internal aspect. It feels like something, and you can't really describe it if you don't have it. Now, what is intelligent? There are lots of different definitions. I just grabbed last night in preparation for this. I grabbed one from the Wikipedia site on intelligence, as good as any. It's sort of the general ability to process information, to learn, to quickly learn from new situations, and to figure out how to behave or across various time scales. So when you inferred from that picture of that couple that they're sort of protesting the election of Donald Trump, you're using sort of your native intelligence. Now, ultimately, intelligence is really about functional capability. So ultimately, it's about becoming. Well, conscious experience, and this is also the point of the theory I'm going to present you briefly, is about being, something radical, fundamental, different, although they interrelate. Right, so one is about intelligence is always performing some function, taking some input, processing, storing it for later recall, doing planning, and then ultimately executing some behavior, immediate or in the future. Well, consciousness is partially associated with that, but at the root of consciousness, the experience is really about being. They're two different things, and we shouldn't confound them. So certainly conceptually, you can dissociate intelligence from consciousness. The challenge is, in natural systems, the only one right now where we're sure we have consciousness, i.e. in us and maybe closely related species, such as human and other mammals, they're entangled. In other words, a lot of the neuronal structures that we know from the clinic or from subjects, a lot of the neuronal structures like cortex that are involved in generating conscious experience, for instance, where you can put an electrode in during neurosurgery and you can evoke a specific visual or haptic or somatosensory percept or a percept of wanting an action, of willing an action. Those are also some of the same structure that seem to be involved in some of the computation underlying what we consider various forms of intelligence. So it's not easy to untangle them. And then I'll talk in a bit about computers, which are engineered systems. What's the situation? What's the relationship between consciousness and intelligence in engineered systems? All right, so I'm going to skip this. This is typically what I talk in my what I talk about the neural correlates of consciousness. What are the minimal neuronal mechanisms, neurons, subneuronals, large ensembles, whatever it is, that are necessary for you to see a German Shepherd. They should be, it's a causal concept. In other words, when you artificially induce this neural correlate of consciousness by the surgeon's electrode or by TMS coil or by optogenetics in an animal, the animal or the subject should have that experience. And conversely, if you remove that, if you inactivate, again, by doing halorhodopsin or by doing a lesion or doing some other inactivation study, even though the stimulus may be there, the German Shepherd may be there, and you're looking at it, you shouldn't have it, right? So it's not just observational thing. it's a causal. The idea is causal. These are the set of physical mechanisms that give rise to any one specific conscious content. And then, of course, you can ask what's common about the one that code for color versus motion versus sounds versus abstract concept. Where are they in the brain? Are they of a particular cell type? Yada, yada, yada. And a lot of people do that. So I'll give you two brief insights, sort of just the current state of affairs in two particular neuronal studies before we go to machines. So this last paper that I wrote with Francis Crick, in fact, he dictated literally 2 hours before he passed away, he dictated corrections on this paper to his secretary, and he was incredibly excited about it. I mean, he was a scientist until the very end. So there's this mysterious structure called the Claustrum. How many of you have heard about the Claustrum? How many of you know that you have a Claustrum? Okay, so you all have a Claustrum. All mammals do. You share this with mice. So the human claustrum is maybe that wide from anterior posterior. You have 2 of them. They're tucked underneath the cortex, the insula. They're above the basal ganglia, and they're in the white matter, between the external and the extreme capsules. My true belief is really that cortex is there to protect the claustrum. What's remarkable about it is, similar to the thalamus, they have massive, so this is here DTI in human. There's massive bilateral connections, ipsi and contralateral, to every cortical region. So claustrum projects to cortical regions, and every cortical region, or most every cortical region, projects back. We now know this. This is diffusion tensor imaging at a crude scale in humans. We've published a long paper several years ago at the Allen Institute in the mouse where we do AV virus injection both in the claustrum and in cortex, and we can map numerically. We have detailed numbers that all the different cortical regions that are connected bilateral to the claustrum. Now you can ask, well, isn't that like the thalamus? It is, although the thalamus is of course not a layered structure. This is sort of layered. And you have roughly 50 different nuclei in the thalamus, and they're relatively isolated. While cortex is this continuous, sort of much more sheet-like structure. So this is it in a mouse. The mouse, like any other mammal, has a claustrum. It's roughly here. We did a very detailed reconstruction of it. This is 150 micrometer. So it's like 3 millimeter long in the mouse. The entire mouse, fits comfortably inside a sugar cube, right? It fits inside a 1 by 1 by 1 centimeter cube. So it's roughly 1,000 times smaller. 71 million neurons versus 86 billion neurons in the human brain. So underneath the cortex, you have the claustrum, one left and one right. And we worked, this is one of the things we do routinely. Once we have a structure, we can look for the genes that are expressed in there, all 20,000, and we can identify genes that are very specifically expressed there. And 6 months later, 9 months later, we have a transgenic animal. And then we can couple that transgenic animal to a reporter like a GFP, or we can put a driver like channel rhodopsin there. So in other words, we can manipulate this structure. Because in humans, so the obvious question is, what happens if you lose this structure? So according to Francis and I, we thought that the metaphor we used, the claustrum is the conductor of the cortical symphony. That's not a theory, that's just a metaphor, right? So the idea is you have all these different regions in cortex. Some are responsible for theory of mind, some do social computation, some compute color or motion or sound or voices or whatever. But of course, what's common to any conscious experience is the fact that it's one, it's holistic, it's integrated, right? And so you need something, a structure that can rapidly gather all that information and integrate it. And of course, in a symphony, that's exactly the function of a conductor, right? You have all the different players, and what the conductor does, he or she reads the information from the player, and then by his gesture feeds back information to all the individual player in the orchestra. We believe the function may be similar in humans and non-human animals. So what happens if people lose it? It's very difficult. There are very, very few cases of people who have lost claustrum because it's a very thin and very elongated structure. It's supplied by two arteries, so there isn't a stroke that'll take it out. It's very difficult to do fMRI imaging on it since it's under 1 millimeter, so it's very, very thin. And it's routinely confused, bold activity in the Claustrum is routinely confused with underlying bold activity in the stratum or in the overlying insular cortex. There's one patient, I know it's one patient, who, epileptic patient, they put electrode in her to do the usual functional localization, and every time she was stimulated, she sort of turned into this zombie. She wasn't paralyzed because if she did this, and then they stimulated her, she went into sort of this zombie stage. She had no memory of those episodes for as long as she was stimulated in this one electrode that was in the Claustrum. There was no evidence of any secondary discharge, so it's not like an absence seizure or something like that. And then there are a few cases where people have encephalitis that are unique because of a gene that's specifically expressed in the Claustrum to the Claustrum, and typically they're in a very confusional state. Very difficult to assess, high fever, confusional state. So in animals, of course, with power of optogenetics, once we have genes that have localization to a structure like the Claustrum, we can turn them on or off. But before I do, I wanted to show you this awesome thing. Okay, what this is, these are 6 neurons. These neurons are specifically located in the Claustrum. They are so-called GNB4 positive neurons, so they are expressed in the Claustrum. The neurons themselves are tiny. You can see here, those are the dendrites, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and somewhere there's a 6th. So this is, a 1/4 of a millimeter. These are the axons. They're the biggest axons I've ever seen, the longest axons I've ever seen anywhere.
This is the mouse.
This is a mouse. Yeah, because what this is, it's a so-called FMOS whole brain technique that we're doing routinely now together with collaborators in China. What we do, you take a mouse, you use transgenic to fluorescent a subset of neurons, like these GNB4 neurons or visual cortex, layer 1 neurons, whatever. And then you cut the mouse into 14,000 slices, and you do imaging, block phase imaging on each slice. You cut at a micrometer, do imaging. Then you do that 14,000 times, and then you reconstruct it in 3D. So you can't do that right now in humans. And the point I'm trying to make, we call these crown of thorns neurons, because just like the religious imagery, they project only to cortex, so they're excitatory. Spiny neurons, glutamatergic, they project only to cortex, but massively. Some project to ipsi and contralateral. So it's not specific, at least in the mouse. It's not that some set of Claustrum neurons only go to vision and some other go to auditory. You have individual Claustrum neurons that project very, very widely within the cortex. Here we've reconstructed 26 of them in top-down projection. They're really beautiful. All of this is cortex. They leave out the primary center, or there's very little here. Auditory, visual cortex is here, somatosensory cortex is here, primary auditory. So they leave out the primary areas, but they're very heavy on the cingulate, retrosplenial, prefrontal, and higher order motor areas, massive. And what we can do now, so we use inscopic technology, these little mice with microscopes, they carry microscopes. And then we can do recording either using neural pixels, using these very high density electrodes that we've built together with people at Genelia, or we can use 2-photon calcium imaging. So again, here you see in real time, as the animal is moving around, you're seeing activity in the Claustrum neurons as the animal is moving around, and so we can analyze all of that. And then what we're doing now, doing different different perturbation experiments, either chronically with dreads, where we use a long-term techniques that turns receptor off for a day or two, or we use a short-term halorhodopsin, or we use either excitatory or inhibitory opsins to turn Claustrum neurons on or off. And what you can see here is a massive phenotype. Sorry. So this is a normal mouse in an open field test. Where is it? Yeah, that's just a normal wild type a mouse with saline injection. Runs around normally. Mouse with CNO control, where we injected, where it's it's a different receptor. And here, all right, so you just have to believe me. In this case, when all the neurons, the neurons that express this particular gene, GNB4, are turned off using this CNO agent, the mouse essentially just crouches down and goes to one corner and stays there, compared to the control mouse. So it's a very dramatic phenotype. We're not 100% sure this is a pure Claustrum phenotype, so that's what we're now worrying about. Because occasionally we see some expression in the auditory cortex, in layer 6 of the auditory cortex above the Claustrum, so we have to get more specific. But it shows us the power of what you can do in a mouse compared to, I mean, of course it would be nicer and more direct if we can do this in humans, but we can't. And so we're doing these experiments to study sort of the neural basis of behavior, in this case, something closely, that in humans would be closely associated with consciousness in animals. All right, and that's the only NCC story I wanted to tell, because I wanted to make a few larger points. So ultimately, in the fullness of time, we'll have the NCC. In other words, sooner or later, we will know that these neurons activated in this way, in these layers, in that part of the brain, gives rise to any one conscious experience, or to a particular experience, like seeing color or hearing my mom's voice, okay? All the evidence points that the most critical structure for that is neocortex. So we have to ask, what is it special about neocortex that gives rise to conscious experience? Why not, for example, cerebellum? There's lots and lots of evidence that you probably all know 80% of your neurons are in the cerebellum. They're some of the most gorgeous neurons. They're the so-called Purkinje cell. The most numerous neurons are tiny little granule cells there's 60 billion of them, more than any other neuron. You can lose them, like in this patient. She never had them. She's one of the rare cases of cerebellar agenesis. She was born without cerebellum. Or you can talk like I've done to patients who just 3 months ago lost 3 by 3 by 4 centimeter of their cerebellum. It was taken out by a neurosurgeon because they have a glioblastoma. You can talk with them. They feel no change in their conscious experience of the world. They hear fine. They see fine. They have consciousness of self. They have memory. Whatever the cerebellum does, it isn't involved in consciousness. And so you have to ask, well, what's wrong with it? It has loops, it has input maps, it has output maps, it has glorious neurons, it has dendritic spiking activity, it has calcium spike, everything you expect of neurons, yet somehow it's not sufficient to give rise to consciousness. During cortex, right, when people in cortex during an epileptic seizure, when people typically become unconscious, there's lots of neural activity, and the brain is hypersynchronized for all those people who believe synchronization is important for consciousness, but you lose consciousness there. In sleep, I've recorded many here with Gabriel Kremer. In patient, he's recorded many neurons during sleep. You can see neurons fire during sleep. There's activity going on. Yet in certain phases of your sleep, like slow wave sleep, when the neurons still fire, it's not that the brain goes sort of dead. There's no conscious experience. Where's the difference? It's not that during sleep my brain dissolves into some sort of soup. What about a case like that? This is of great practical importance. I'll come back to that. This is a patient of Nico Schiff. When you have a patient like this who doesn't move, he can only say one thing. He says one thing over and over and over and over again, hundreds of times a day. It's the only thing he ever says. Does it feel like anything to be this patient? Is this patient still there? There's still some islands of isolated activity. This is a 2D PET scan. Is the patient still having any experience? Then we need a more hard question for which we need a theory. We need a theoretical foundational theory, ultimately grounded in physics, that tells us, for instance, when does consciousness happen? When was the first time you ever had a conscious experience? Was it when you came out of your mother's womb? You know, you had to start breathing yourself, and because you weren't on your mom's lifeline anymore. When you saw a real, when you had real strong visual input, and when you heard outside, was that the first time? What about a preterm baby like here, 24 weeks old, clearly alive? Does it feel like something? And how do we know? How can we test? There are very strange cases of consciousness. This is 2 little girls that live north of Seattle. They're identical twins, and they're grown together at the level of they have a so-called thalamic bridge. So the two skulls are grown together, and it's amazing. You watch these videos, and you see these girls, they run around like any other girl of that age, but they're always stuck together with their sister. And the neurons are contiguous at the level of the thalamus. We don't know much about them. The parents don't want them to be studied scientifically, and of course you can't put them in a normal fMRI scanner. There's some evidence from the New York Times journalists that visited them that this girl can look over here, and this girl can look over there, and this girl has access to visual information that this girl sees. So under some strange condition like this, where the brains are sort of partially intergrown, do we have two consciousness, or do we have one consciousness? The cases of sleepwalking and other parasomnias, where it's not at all clear whether people are whether they're conscious or not, yet they perform highly routine stereotype things like driving, like walking, like going to the bathroom, opening cupboards, etc. What about it's now becoming a problem? NIH just convened a workshop that I attended where we talked about brain in a dish, right? So you take stem cells from under the arm, you put it in a dish, you add 4 transcription factors, you wait 6 months, and you get brain tissue, forebrain tissue that expresses a lot of the same genes that are expressed by cortical neurons in, let's say, second trimester fetal tissue, with including some calcium activity, all right? Right now, they're still very small. They're millimeter or 2, like Paula Arolla at Harvard or people at Stanford or elsewhere. People are now building 3-dimensional scaffolding and are doing cellular engineering. So in principle, in the not too distant future, we'll be able to grow large networks of this, just like cortex, right? Cortex is like a pizza, the size of a pizza, 2 to 3 millimeter thin. But now imagine you can grow this in a dish, and you perfuse it with various factors so it keeps alive. It shows neural activity. Well, at what point does it start feeling like something? This is a question that the field now is confronted with. We don't have good answers. Then what about animals that are very different? So this is the bee. Bee is an amazingly complex creature, can do single face recognition, has a waggle dance, has a very elaborate social routine when they have to pick a new home, when they swarm in the spring. Their mushroom bodies here are 10 times denser than anything we have in our brain. They only have 1 million neurons, but the circuit complexity is higher. Does it feel like something to be a bee? Does bee have any experience? What about group mind? Right? If you have a group of people like tightly working together, like special forces soldiers, or group of people that are, work together towards a common goal, people often assert that there's a group mind. In other words, there's some entity above and beyond the individuals that feels like something. Is that true? Can you measure that? And then, of course, I'll come back. We're facing computers like Alexa that invades our home, and within our lifetime, over the next 20 years, there's no doubt, right? Alexa will be as clever as you and I. In fact, Alexa will remember everything. She'll remember all the jokes, and she'll play them back at you, and she'll have perfect poise and intonation, much better than your spouse, much more patient. And of course, you can turn her off at will. Can't do that with your spouse. So how can we possibly deny her? And of course, of course she'll say she feels like something, right? Don't hurt my feelings. Of course I'm conscious. So how do we know, really? So ultimately what we need a physical-based theory, a fundamental theory that tells us whether any piece of physics, like, I'm looking for my cell phone, like this piece of physics, right, or this piece of physics, under what condition does a piece of highly organized matter give rise to conscious sensation? Ultimately, the brain is a piece of furniture like anything else in the universe, subject to the same laws of quantum mechanics and relativity. We don't believe in special soul stuff anymore, but still there seems to be some dramatic difference, I believe, between this and this, at least at the current state. And so there is this psychiatrist and neuroscientist, Giulio Tononi, in Madison, and he's sort of worked on this IIT, the theory of integrated information theory of consciousness, that I'm not going to explain because typically, so we give lectures on this a week long, in fact 2 months from now in Venice. It's a complicated mathematical formal theory. So the theory starts with some fundamental postulates. It says, it describes what is common what is common to every possible conscious experience? It's sort of like a Kantian transcendental properties. It asks, what are the properties of any experience? It exists for itself. It doesn't require anybody else. It is structured. Even an experience of pure space, just in total black, has left and right and up and down and neighborhood and far away and sectors, all of that. It is distinct. It is one experience out of trillion other experiences I could be having. It is one. It is integrated. It's holistic. And it's definite. It has definite borders. In other words, there are certain things that are in this experience, and there are certain things that are out. When I have an experience of pure space, I don't at the same time also have an experience of my blood pressure or experience of color red or being upset. That's a different experience. Each experience is the way it is. It's very particular, very peculiar. And then the theory is also fundamental. It makes some fundamental claim about what exists, about ontology. So it goes back to Aristotle and to a statement in Plato's Sophist, where there's this conversation between a young mathematician and the Eleatic stranger from the Italian city of Elias, which is sort of a stand-in for Parmenides and Zenon. And it says, Plato says, expresses through this Eleatic stranger the sentiment that anything exists in the measure that it makes a difference. The more you make a difference to the world, the more you exist. And if you think about it, what we think exists in physics, for instance, or things that we used to think exist but don't exist anymore, like the ether in physics, ultimately we have this implicit principle. What exists is what has causal power upon others. If you claim there's a little angel on the backside of the moon, but it doesn't affect me, and I can't affect it in any way, then it may as well may not exist because it doesn't make any difference. This theory postulates that ultimately what consciousness is, it's causal power upon itself. Any system that has causal power upon itself, that is what conscious experience is. So you can think it's really part of physics. In fact, you can take a monist, a Russellian monist position. You can say, well, physics studies the relationship among things, whether they're quarks or electrons or genes or whatever it is, right? It studies the relationship among things. It doesn't really study the inside of things. And conscious experience is simply how physics feels from the inside. So my conscious experience is how the physics of the brain, that is a system that has huge amount of cause-effect power upon itself. In other words, its current state can determine its future state, and its previous state determines its current state. The more causal power you have upon itself, the more intrinsic cause-effect power you have upon yourself, the more you exist, the more consciousness you have. So the theory develops this into a mathematical calculus that I won't attempt to describe. It's a well-determined calculus. Essentially, it says you look at any system, like 3 neurons here or 4 transistors here, and you look at their connectivity, you look at sort of their transition probability matrix. You can write down for any particular system in a particular state, you can write down how much cause effect it has, and you can build this, you can then describe, the theory then makes this assertion. It's an identity theory. It's a very strong claim. It doesn't say that this is proportional to consciousness, or it relates to consciousness, or it's necessary for consciousness. The theory says, ultimately, this intrinsic cause-effect power is what consciousness is. It's an identity theory. In other words, anything, any property of any conscious experience has its direct counterpart in this cause-effect space. Right? The structure in this cause-effect space describes the quality of any conscious experience, why color feels different from motion, feels different from pain, is different from pleasure. There's also a quantity associated with it that some of you will know called phi. So phi essentially measures the irreducible of a system. You have a system, how much does the system exist for itself? Well, if it only exists for itself if it exists as a whole. So if phi is 0, the system doesn't exist for itself. It may as well be decomposed because there isn't anything above and beyond the individual parts. So any system that has a phi, this non-negative number, has some conscious experience. How big the phi is tells you how conscious that system is. Now you can say, well, that's all pretty crazy and far out there, and it seems like it. I grant you that. Although partly this because we take these things so for granted. We take experience for granted. We rarely ever think about it because it's the only way, it's the only world we know. The only world we know is the world that we see and hear and touch, and so we take it for granted. And we rarely think in science, we rarely think about fundamental what really exists and how do I know anything exists. All right, so the theory has a number of experimental, makes a number of experimental predictions. One is the following. So it says any system like the brain or like a computer, but here we're talking about brain, that supports consciousness has to be integrated and differentiated. So already 12 years ago, a whole bunch of people decided, well, let's test this experimentally. So they built what's called a zap and zip conscious meter. So essentially what it is, you put a TMS pulse onto a cortex, various location cortex. You pulse it 50, 60, 70 times. You have to average it. You record high-density EEG, 64 channels, although now people do 32 channels. And you look at the resulting movie. You unfold it, and you essentially compress it. You use the Lempel-Ziff compression algorithm. That's where the zip comes from, to compress it. So you essentially ask, how complex is the response? How complex is the response? How integrated and differentiated is this response? If each one of those EEG electrodes records something totally independent, it's maximally complex, but it's not very integrated. In fact, that's, or if it's like an epileptic seizure, then everybody will be you get these EEG waves that are in lockstep across this spatial temporal movie. Again, that isn't really complexity. So they defined a number called PCI, perturbation complexity index, that's between 0 and 1. And so now what they do, they take normal people and put them, when they go to sleep, in deep sleep, when they don't have conscious experience, and you ascertain that by waking them up and saying, the last 20 seconds when I zipped you, did anything go to your mind? You take people, volunteers, and anesthetize them using different types of anesthetic, xenon, ketamine, and two other anesthetics. You take brain patients that have lesions that don't impair consciousness, like, for example, a phasic lesion. The patient can't talk anymore, but the patient is fully conscious. And in each case, you measure the brain complexity using this measure. And so you can do that. So these are volunteers that were anesthetized, midazolam, xenon, and propofol. Here you put people that go to sleep. Here you put people under light doses of ketamine where they're taking it as a drug, so not as an anesthetic. Here they're conscious. Here you take normal healthy subjects. So what you do in each case, you do this procedure 5 times, and then you pick the highest number. So each one of these is a subject or patient. And here you have controls where you're very sure, like a locked-in state, or as I said, lesions that don't impair consciousness. And so empirically, you find a threshold, in this case 0.31, doesn't really matter. So with 0.31, I can, with 100% specificity and 100% sensitivity, I can find all the true positives and I can detect all the true negatives. In other words, I can always tell from the outside by looking at your cortical response whether right now, for the last 2 minutes, you were conscious or not. This study is now being repeated in a number of clinical centers, including here at MGH, because this, for the possibility of building a general conscious meter. Here now, this is more tricky because now you have patients, so these are called MCS plus. There you're very confident that they have some minimal, so what this stands for is minimal conscious subject, minimal conscious state. Here, people are pretty sure they're conscious. Here they're less sure, and these are so-called vegetative state. So of course here you find that, as I said before, people who by all other means you cannot communicate with them, at least in the context of a clinic. This is not a quiet fMRI lab. This is in the context of a clinic, which imposes all sorts of constraints. These patients are considered vegetative state by their response to of their brain to this magnetic pulse. They seem to have the same complexity as a normal person who is conscious. So if you take this serious at face value, it seems to suggest, yes, there's roughly 20% of people that get misdiagnosed, which is compatible with other evidence from the clinic. So as I said, there are lots of people who are trying to generalize this to look at other patients, like catatonic patients, like pediatric patients in children, and also doing this in animals with cortex, like a monkey or mouse even, where you can experimentally turn consciousness on or off. All right, so that's practical progress. No matter what you think about your ideological position on consciousness, it helps. There are thousands of these patients where we are not at all sure whether they're conscious, and this is a device that can get at that. Now, I wanted to come to computer. So what is the function per integrated information theory? What is the function of consciousness? So per se, this is a physical theory, IIT. It's just a theory like Coulomb's theory, or the standard model of physics, right? And you don't, of course, go around and ask what's the function of quarks, or what's the function of up and down, or color, or charm, right? It's just what we find ourselves in the universe. However, what you can do, so you can do simulated evolution. So what you can do, I used to do this when I was still at Caltech, you can have these simple creatures that move through mazes, they have eyes and motor, like Breitenberg vehicles. You can give them a genome, you randomize it, and you send them into a maze, and you pick you send thousands of them into a maze, you pick the 10 best performers, you perturb their genome randomly, you generate the next generation, you put them into the maze again, you always pick the winners, you do the 60,000 generation. All right? And then you get creatures that are adapted, more or less adapted to this particular environment. And what you can see very nice, so this is the degree of adaptation of these. In other words, this is how quickly they traverse the maze. This is a so-called Einstein. This is a creature that we designed to go optimal by the fastest route through any maze. The mazes are randomly generated. They're not the ones that were evolved on. And so this is perfectly adapted. And you can see there's this nice relationship between the minimal amount of phi and the degree of adaptation. It makes sense. Integrated information theory is about integrating all the different components, all the different modules, the different sensors into one whole. And of course, that's going to make it much more efficient rather than having a whole lot of specialized module. And you can see that. So the idea is that in a world where natural selection acts, you select for brains that are most efficient. We can call this adaptation or some level of intelligence, so evolutionary time scale. But it also happens to maximize the amount of consciousness these simulated creatures have. So this is the one slide that's really disconcerting for functionalists. So here what you have two simple networks, a nonlinear one. These are simple simple cellular neurons. In this case, with a threshold, with simple threshold, connected with excitation inhibition. They have a well-defined. So you give some input states, you march through, and you get some output state. Here you take the network, unfold it, turn it into a completely feed-forward network that functionally has exactly the same input-output mapping. So in other words, you have two boxes. The boxes have some simple neural networks inside. In both cases, you feed some input, and you get for the same input, two boxes, the same output. So from a functional point of view, right, functionalism is dominant today. Of course, it's a zeitgeist. From a functional point of view, they're fully equivalent, right, because they perform the same input-output function. IIT says, however, you can compute this very explicitly. I mean, it's a nice thing having about a quantitative theory. You just compute it. This system has cause-effect power upon itself. What do I mean by that? Because it's feedback connected in non-trivial ways, the current state will influence its next state. The previous state will influence its current state. Well, this system is a feed-forward network, so its current state will not influence its next state. And you can compute the phi of this is 0. So this system has no cause-effect power. This system has. So if the theory is true, and the theory is amenable to empirical tests, could be false, could be true, that says that in principle there cannot be a Turing test in principle for intelligence, because if you believe intelligence ultimately a function, an I/O function, then at least in principle you can build two automata that have the same input-output function. One has high causal power, one has no. One is conscious, the other one not. Now, you can also try, this is work in progress, you can try to take a simple model of a von Neumann machine, a minimal von Neumann machine with a little clock, with a clock here with data register, with a simple 7-bit transition matrix here, with a very simple logic that does a simple computation here. This is a very simple computer, but of course it's universal. You can generalize it to from 7 state to 11 state to 13 state. And again, you can show per IIT, you can compute the integrated information of this creature. It is very, very low because of the wiring. So if you look at different networks and you ask how much integrated information is there, typically you get sort of very large numbers if you have networks that have high fan-in and fan-out and are highly heterogeneous, where each of the gates are doing something different. You get typically very low phi in networks that are sparsely connected and that are all the same. It's just a property of this particular metric. So what that means is that what IIT says that you cannot do a simple input-output test, at least conceptually, a simple Turing test, because of course you can always get, once you know what the Turing test is, you can always teach the network how to pass that particular Turing test with machine learning, and you know it can do it. And also because of this property that two systems can have the same input-output mapping, but one can have a high phi and the other one not. Furthermore, the theory says that digital computers, simple digital computers, and the proof will generalize, will have, of course they have some causal effect power, some minimal causal effect power, but it's tiny and it doesn't depend on the program that's run. So you can use that little network and compute phi for different mappings. You can compute it for one type of mapping, and for a different type of mapping, the phi and the conceptual structure, the cause effect power doesn't change. So in other words, it makes this very powerful prediction that even if we build a computer that can perfectly well simulate the human brain, either via Alexa, because it talks like us, or because Henry Markham's wildest dreams have come true, and he's built this perfect replica of 100 billion neurons, and every synapse and every neuron is there, just like in the human brain. And you turn on the computer, this gigantic computer simulation, and of course it says, I'm conscious, but don't believe it, it's all fake, okay? Because you cannot ultimately simulate. Consciousness is not a particular type of computation. You have to build it into the causal structure of the system. You have to look at it, to say whether a creature is conscious, you have to look at the hardware, you have to look at their brain if you want, and their CPU, and you cannot simulate it on a digital computer. And the way to best explain this to physicists and engineers is the following. I have a friend, she's a theoretical astrophysicist. She writes down code on her laptop that simulates Einstein's equation, you know, the 9-field equation, linking curvature to mass distribution. So when she runs her program on the central mass at the center of our galaxy, right, that's 10 to the 6 solar masses, she predicts that it's a black hole. In other words, that the computer program running on her laptop predicts that the gravity is so strong that not even light can escape. But funny enough, she does not get sucked into this computer. She doesn't get sucked into the laptop. Now, why is that? It simulates, it's a perfect simulation of it, right? Because general relativity describes the link between curvature and mass. Why is it? Well, it's a difference between the simulated and the real. The real actually has causal power. In this case, it has causal power to bend space-time, to curve space-time. The computer simulation simulates this high-level mathematical mapping, but doesn't have the same causal power. And so it is with consciousness. Yes, you can perfectly well, and Alexa shows this, you can perfectly well simulate a lot of the behavior that we in humans associate with consciousness, but that's not the same as actually generating consciousness. And so I want to end with this slide. We find ourselves in a universe where historically the link, so if here we plot some measure of intelligence, like generalized G factor or something like that, and here we plot phi, this measure of consciousness, that we live in a universe populated by evolved creatures where, you know, you have this sort of, as a brain gets more complex, you know, from a medusa to a bee to a mouse to a glorious Bernese mountain dog to a human, we believe that as the brain increases in complexity, the capacity for having highly complex conscious states increases, right? But that's in evolved systems that have particular causal structures. Now, we find ourselves, we're adding stuff to the universe. We build things like, this is No, not Watson, the chess computer, 1999. Deep Blue, IBM Deep Blue that beat Kasparov in chess. This is of course AlphaGo, Demis Hassabis. The Google cars, Uber cars, Alexa. All of them will be along this axis. In fact, we don't know whether there's a natural limit, whether this axis extends indefinitely. And conversely, so there's this double dissociation between intelligence and consciousness. Because I claim these creatures, it doesn't feel like anything. And even if we reach generalized artificial general intelligence, AGI, will be out here and they'll be as smart as us, or maybe they'll be smarter than us. But there's no consciousness. Conversely, certainly the IIT predicts that there will be structures like, for example, if you build these neural nets out of brain organoids, you make them large enough, if they have sufficient high degree of connectivity, they may well be conscious, but having very limited input-output capability unless you provide them with sensors and with arms and with actuators. If you don't provide them, they will be conscious, but without having any function. And so that's where I wanted to leave you with. Thank you much for your attention.